George Floyd is murdered by Minneapolis PD officer, or we can say former Minneapolis PD officer, Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin previously had killed a man, Anthony Reyes, and had gone on to shoot other people after killing Reyes, leading up to the point of him kneeing on the throat of Floyd for 9 minutes until Floyd stopped moving, dead. He kept his knee on his throat for 2 minutes after he became non-responsive. Apparently, he just wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to resist after the, 9 minutes of depriving of oxygen and just health. Chauvin killed him in slow motion, casually, while the other officers watched and even participated. So Chauvin is being charged with second-degree murder and a manslaughter charge. I forget the specific charge. The other officers are being charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter, if I'm not mistaken. But nevertheless, all four has been charged, but Chauvin is getting the lion's share of the charges. But this is not about Chauvin exactly. The protests erupted all over, setting the police station on fire, which was iconic. I've never seen anything like that in America. And you had protests erupt over 140 cities in all 50 states. Thousands and thousands of people, movement, all of them, under this notion of social justice. Not necessarily on the same page, but definitely on the same page in the sense that what took place was absolutely wrong. And while they're not necessarily entirely a demand, there's a feeling about it. Meaning that feeling at some point, as these groups go on and on and on, will become a demand, and those demands will get broader as they start making larger critiques against the system itself. The question becomes, can the state and the mechanisms of the state drown this out before this becomes something more substantial and more consistent? Minneapolis, right now, have apparently passed a ruling or has agreed to a ruling that would ban the chokehold in Minnesota. Now, I imagine people are celebrating this as a win, and I suppose it is. Minneapolis agrees to ban chokeholds and neck restraints by police. Police in Minneapolis will be forbidden to use chokeholds and neck restraints under reforms negotiated by the city and the state authorities. In an emergency vote on Friday, the Minneapolis City Council approved an agreement with the State Department of Human Rights, which earlier this week opened up an investigation into the killing of George Floyd by city police. The temporary restraining order requires the city to update the procedures to ban the chokeholds and other neck restraints. Now, of course, I'm happy for the people in Minneapolis who won't be choked to death, at the very least on camera, by a cop because they're going to ban this chokehold. Fair enough. And that brings other questions if you can just ban it like that, why were you using it in the first place? And we should also understand that Daniel Pantaleo in New York used an illegal chokehold, meaning they make the chokehold illegal and the officer still uses the chokehold anyway, which basically killed Eric Garner. We need to understand something else. Amy Klobuchar was the person in charge, meaning the DA for Minnesota, when he killed this person and when he shot the other people. And at no point was she willing to bring charges. Her injecting herself into this trial, going to the funeral, is utterly gross because in many respects, she has some level of culpability of him being in that casket for her not doing her job when she was in a position of authority to do that job. And I find that to be all of them, whether that's Joe Biden, whether that's Obama, all of these people now who are trying to co-opt this particular movement had a position at some point in their career where they could have did something to materially benefit in real ways. Biden basically worked to put as many black bodies as possible in prison during those time periods. And of course, Obama draining 95% of the income to the top 1% and being willing to cut Social Security, letting homeowners go bust, was not necessarily the best thing for the economic health of the people of a particular persuasion. I'm happy for Minnesota. I'm happy that the protesters were able to get crumbs. But what about the rest of this nation? The protests weren't localized in Minnesota. This wasn't a situation where 100 people went out in Minnesota and marched around a barn. This is all across the United States, because regardless of where something like this takes place, we feel it as if it's one of us, one of our neighbors, because we understand this threatening idea that at any particular moment, a cop who's engaging you could flip out and dispense maximum justice for the tiniest of infractions. And more often than not, would walk. They would walk, and their partners would back them up, just like Chauvin's partners watched him murder the guy. Or the other partners were the gentleman who fell, back his head, blood all over the place, and then they say he tripped. They would back their story up. Back their story up. What about the rest of the country? I'm happy for Minnesota. What about the rest of the country? This issue is not localized to Minnesota. Eric Garner was choked to death in New York. I'm happy for Minnesota, but the fact that these protests are going on all across the United States, this is massively, radically inadequate in regards to a response. This needs to be something that is addressed, not just in Minnesota. This is policing all across the United States that has certain tenors, has certain ways in which they train these cops. And the arguments that we're having right now in regards to police abuse or abuse of authority, those things are being visited on us right now. Meaning every person that's hit, every person whose rights is basically flagrantly ignored, is emboldened, at the very least from the standpoint of this kind of exponential irony, that you're beating a person who is there to protest the fact that you're beating people. It's like the very act of violence affirms their being there, or their very meaning in being there. I want to go through police being maniacs. And I want to ask the very question at the end. Does this help you when you're engaging the public like this? And beyond, does this help you when you engage in the public like this? Are you sick and tired of them asking you to do things that you have neither the skill, nor intelligence, nor the capability, nor the station to do? You can't solve poverty, and yet they throw you into that particular situation as opposed to dealing with the actual poverty. I'm making the point that, yes, it is difficult to be a cop. They deal with things that are disastrous for people to have to deal with. I'm making the very basic point, though, that there's another part of that equation that is often ignored. Democrats take that stuff off the table, missing the point that you can't take that off the table if you want to have a cohesive society. This cult of neoliberalism. No, reality does not care about your preconceptions in regards to what you want, doesn't care about your ideology. And there are times where you have to deal with the material concerns of the public in order to bring the hostilities and the conflict between these groups down. I'm making the basic point that because we are doing this kind of mass movement, the actions that need to take place need to be en masse. Meaning Minnesota in and of itself is not enough. This needs to be something that is passed over the entire nation as a law. And it needs to go beyond just this little banning stuff. The amount of energy that's being dumped into these protests, these things are going all around the world. They should not be squandered or thrown away for trivial items, such as not having the chokehold. And I don't mean trivial in the sense that a person who's not going to be killed by a cop using that chokehold. I don't mean it in that sense. I just mean it in the context to the movement that is taking place right now. And in context to what we need as a society in regards to our relationship with the criminal justice system. It needs to be revamped. It is greatly problematic. And the videos I'm going to show you is going to make that point that much more clear. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, like, share, subscribe. You can always support PayPal, Patreon. Let's go through some of these videos. Now, the cops, supposedly, at least on an overt level, we are a democracy. And because we're a democracy, we want people to be able to go and protest. Great. You have people protesting in all 50 states, tens of thousands. Initially, it started off with the burning shit down. Then the protests became basically peaceful, and the cops got utterly and entirely belligerent. Very angry at the fact that people are protesting the fact that cops get very belligerent. and they're looking for a different way. I strongly believe that this protest will grow into broader concerns. I don't know how it can't grow into broader concerns, especially if you're going to have a mix of people there, and those people are having this discussion about how station in life, how race, how class, the monetary amount that you have in your wallet, the jobs that you have, all of those things influence whether or not, or your chances of being in contact with the law in a way that's not necessarily in the best ends. Let's start here. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. Philadelphia.
Oh, they got shot.
I'm not going to go through all these. I think you get the point. Here's another one. And this one, after George Floyd, by the way, we're again kneeling on a person's neck. Minnesota apparently is going to get rid of that chokehold. Great. What about the other states? If we know that kneeling on a person's neck for 9 minutes can kill that person, whether that person was healthy, whether that person had COVID-19, whether that person had some kind of lung issue or some kind of other health defect, doesn't necessarily matter. That person was walking, ambulatory, and awake before that officer imparted that much force against that particular individual. If we know that those things can kill, how do we justify going one more day without that being law everywhere? When we are making our case that there's something fundamentally wrong with the criminal justice system in this country, with the laws that govern that justice system, with the powers that are given to cops in the way that they go about their jobs, with the procedures that these guys use, the invasive technique, we are making a point that this is wrong and it needs to fundamentally change. And the way that these guys can be maniacs and then get off without any accountability needs to fundamentally change. There needs to be consequences to bad behavior, especially from the standpoint of cops. If they're going to get that much authority, then yeah, they should have that much more consequence when they break and fuck up in that authority. The system needs to change. This is not enough. Yes, it's nice. You're not going to choke people to death. That's the most rational thing in the world. And yet, this was apparently a concession that we had to actually fight for in order to get. I'm talking about the larger concerns and the larger gains in situations where you don't have cops beating the shit out of people like that without any level of consequence or accountability. Again, just like Floyd, no accountability for Chauvin. Or Daniel Pantaleo, no accountability. And in this case, Cuomo lying, pretending that his cops aren't out there flagrantly abusing those people who are out there. They never learn. I mean, for whatever they want to say in the nice words about taking a knee and everything else, allowing cops to go out there and bash and beat the shit out of protesters, and you keep those guys on the force in the same way they kept Chauvin on the force, or the same way they kept Pantaleo on the force. You know those guys are dirty, you know those guys are more aggressive than others, and you know what they're doing to the public, and you give them a blind pass. The moment that they kill somebody, again, infinitely foreseeable because you gave them a blind pass. And they do this across the United States, and it's only now coming home to roost when they have to have all of these cops out there, and these cops are doing business as usual, and people are aghast by what is considered business as usual. I'll end this here. Like, share,